Hi, everyone. It's Kitty Crysdale here from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're here for the first time. Each week, I take some time to talk about what's been happening in the aquatic industry. Typically, I'm sharing the vast majority of these news stories in our weekly newsletter that comes out on Wednesdays. Today, I'm going to be talking about everything that happened in the last week leading up to the June 24, 2026 newsletter. I do want to give a trigger warning from the outset. There's some pretty heavy topics in this newsletter, and I'm going to be going into a lot of detail, more so than I do in the newsletter, which is linked in the description box down below. The focus of this week's newsletter is a lot of different updates on things that have been happening in the aquatic industry. If you have been subscribed to the newsletter for any length of time, you might be familiar with my own personal and professional interests and how they align with my work in aquatics, consulting, teaching, training. I do try and keep the newsletter fairly balanced, whether you're a facility operator, a lifeguard, a pool manager. I want everyone to find some value in the newsletter, but I also think it's important to have a distinct perspective. And on some of these topics today, I may seem like a bit of an outlier in terms of some stories are obvious why they're important to our industry, other stories maybe not so much. So let's get into it. There's going to be 4 big updates this week. We're going to be talking about Cultus Lake, British Columbia. We're going to be talking about Camp Mystic in Texas. We're going to be talking about Emilie Kiser in Arizona. And we're going to be talking about the Kitsilano Pool in British Columbia. This is also in addition to all of the shorter, briefer news updates that I'm going to be giving. So this is probably going to be a longer update, a longer video, a longer vlog or podcast, however you like to think about it. I am cognizant each week to try and fit in as much as I can in under 45 minutes. I'm grateful to those of you who stick with me because I have a bit of a hive mind, and sometimes it takes me a while to get to the point, and it's a little bit more chit chat, so to speak. So last week here in Canada, June 15th, there was the initial report of the Cultus Lake Waterpark electrocution in British Columbia. That is something that we covered last week, where 12 children went to hospital. They were at this outdoor water park in British Columbia as part of an end of year school trip. And as best as we know, based on the facts available at the time of last week's newsletter publication and this week's newsletter publication, they believe that the electricity was running through a handrail at the bottom of a water slide. Sorry, not the bottom, like not in the run out, but in the waiting area approaching of a water slide. So the big development in this week's newsletter that I wanted to share is that the initial probe from Technical Safety BC, which is the investigative agency who will be doing a deep review, they are doing a deep review of what happened there. The initial probe has found electrical non-compliance. This was something I talked about extensively in the certified pool operator class this week. Some of you know I'm a Pool and Hot Tub Alliance certified pool operator instructor. And so electrical safety, electrocution, prevention of these types of incidents is a pertinent part of our risk management in the class. Pool operations, management of aquatic facilities, facility safety, etc. The big thing we don't know at this stage is the extent of the electrical non-compliance. We don't know if it's the equipment, we don't know if it's the application, the installation, we don't know if we're talking about one site or multiple sites. We don't know if the equipment deteriorated over time, it shouldn't have been used in the first place. This, on the one hand, we could say, duh, obvious, children went to hospital, several went via air ambulance, they were life flighted via helicopter. This is very serious. Of course, there was electrical non-compliance, but the extent of it is really not indicated as of yet. And I suspect due to the seriousness of this incident, the potential legal impact. Families may want to sue the water park or sue people responsible for the work or the equipment. I suspect technical safety BC is going to be pretty tight lipped until they come out with their final report. The very good news about British Columbia and amusement devices, which includes water slides, is that all of their technical reports are publicly available to anyone on their website. So last week, I spent quite a bit of time digging into all of the water slide specific incidents in the last few years, and all of those reports and appendices and findings and photos. Some are more complex than others. Some are only a 2-page report. Others were 50-page reports. All of those can be downloaded by anybody who's interested. So once there is conclusive information, which honestly may take months, a year, it will be posted and available for distribution. But for context, it's a different jurisdiction, but also in an upcoming newsletter, we're going to be talking about the Surfside condo collapse in Florida that happened in 2021. There was some conclusive information released 2 years ago, but the final report only came out in the last few weeks, which was 5 years later. I don't think it's going to be quite the same in British Columbia for Cultus Lake in terms of the scale of the incident. The scale of injury, unfortunately, is significantly less than the 150 people who died in that condo collapse. But it will take time, especially if the investigation redirects to other agencies or departments that need to provide comment on the incident. So that was the first update I wanted to provide, and I thought it was kind of timely because this week I have 2 cars, a truck and a car, and I'm going to be doing a road trip later this year, and the car, which I would describe as my husband's car, we took it to the dealership this week in advance of this big road trip we have planned because I wanted to get it checked out. It's been almost 2.5 years since it was at a car dealership for a detailed inspection, not just, a peace of mind visual inspection when you get your oil change or your tires rotated or swapped for the winter. I actually went out of my way to take it in for a deep, I paid a fee for a full inspection of the car. And it was interesting because I was fully expecting, after 2.5 years of driving this car without oversight, rolling over almost 170,000 kilometers. The car is 8, approaching 9 years old. It's been well maintained, but it is not a new car. And there was I paid the bill, $4,300 worth of repairs that had to be made: struts, axle, brakes, coolant, things that were important. And I really believe if I hadn't done that, we would have gotten, halfway to Florida from Alberta, and the car would have broken down and we would have been stranded and our plans would have been delayed and it would have been very expensive and frustrating. But it's interesting, and I share this because my husband, who's not really a mechanical kind of person, he was in the army, so he can build you an ambush, but he's not so good with cars and things. He had said, "Wow, I can't believe there's almost $5,000 worth of stuff to do, but we've been driving the car for 2.5 years, and we can't expect that things aren't happening to equipment that's been operating, especially given that we live in Alberta and the winters are harsh. We drive it all through the winter. There's road salt, moisture, rust. Anyway, you guys know you're in maintenance, you're in pool operations. But the tie-in for me was so obvious that the operating hours, the usage outside of a system that is enclosed, people think my pool pump is okay or my brakes on my car are okay because we don't notice any issues, but we also can't see them until it's catastrophic. So it is important that we are in the maintenance and prevention of repair business, not waiting for things to get worse. The second story that I wanted to provide an update on in this week's newsletter was Camp Mystic. Camp Mystic is a really horrible story that I have been covering since it first happened last year. To bring you up to speed, if you're not familiar with the story, On July 4th of 2025, there was a girls' sleepaway summer camp in Kerr County, Texas, on the Guadalupe River, and there was flash flooding. And 27 young children, girls, 7, 8, 9 years old, plus their younger counselors, 17, 18 years old, they drowned at that summer camp fatally during this flash flooding. I've covered this incident a number of times in the last year in our newsletters, in our commentary, my commentary rather, in the different videos I've shared on my Instagram stories from different individuals, journalists I follow, commentary I follow. And this story has really struck me for a number of different reasons that I think are pertinent to all aquatic professionals. The first I would say is a legacy organization. Camp Mystic was in existence, is in existence for over 100 years. I believe this year is the 100th anniversary. And so we have these legacy institutions that become very comfortable in the way that they operate. They are very well regarded by their neighbors or their colleagues or the industry at large, their community. And sometimes that can lead people to think that they're too big to fail and not take sufficient precautions. I've been following the in Texas, the House investigate. I believe it's a House investigation. Don't quote me on that, but the public inquiry that led to the final report being issued this week. There have been countless public testimonies from surviving campers, counselors, parents of the deceased children, um, parents and family associated with the camp ownership and management. It is an absolutely terrible story. The co-director of the camp also died drowning, as best as they figure, trying to rescue or save some of the children. And often when I've spoken with aquatic professionals during the last year, some people have said, why do you care about this story? Why does it matter? We're talking about indoor pools or outdoor pools. And the connection with camps to me is so close in the sense that some of you might recall I spoke with Corey de la Pena last year and her movement in the state of Texas to change the bill there in memory of her daughter Kati, who drowned fatally during a summer camp excursion to a swimming pool where the children were not provided life jackets or the right ratio of young children to camp counselors and lifeguards. Anybody who's worked at a pool as a lifeguard knows that big groups of children, whether it is a school activity, an end of year activity for Girl Guides, Boy Scouts, church groups, whether it is a daycare expedition, birthday party, large groups of children without the right ratio of caregivers is very concerning in any environment, not just aquatics, but in aquatics specifically is even more concerning. And I'm going to dig into the final report here later in this video. Once I get through the entirety of the newsletter, I'm going to leave it for the end because I think it'll take me a while to get through my thoughts. But I read the entire 115-page report, and it's even worse than I thought. I knew that there were some basic things, such as the weather wasn't being adequately monitored, an absence of emergency procedures, an absence of training, an incorrect ratio of counselors with experience with leadership to young campers. But going through the report, which I'll take you through at the end of this video, it's just a textbook example of everything going wrong where there was every possible layer for prevention. You know how we talk about in water safety and drowning prevention, layers of protection, right? Teach a child how to swim and give them supervision and install a pool fence and there's so many things disturbing in this final report about Camp Mystic that are also applicable to any aquatic organization, rec organization, youth, sports, any type of organization. There's lessons about leadership failures, communication failures, training failures, preparedness failures. Like, it is just astounding. And in the business world, we talk about Harvard business cases, like when something is so unique or so perfect or so many circumstances come together, it's worth learning from. And I think that's where I'm going to continue to keep covering Camp Mystic, because it is just absolutely shocking. And I think we're at the start of something very big that we're going to keep hearing about probably for a decade to come. This is going to be in the news for a long time based on the litigation that I have no doubt there was some already starting before this report was issued. But if you read this report and you weren't suing somebody, I think you would be inclined to decide that you want to, unfortunately. So I'll circle back to that later in the video. If it is too much for you to read an entire report or to stay on and listen to that commentary, I do recommend a video I have linked in the newsletter. It is on Instagram. I apologize. I don't like to link to things that are not accessible to everyone if you don't have an Instagram account. But sometimes there's journalists and commentators who are doing off the cuff like I'm doing here. This is not pre-scripted. This is me just going in one shot. Um, Rania Mancarios in Texas, a journalist there who's also been beating the drum of Camp Mystic and camp safety. She brought up some really interesting comments that I hadn't considered and I think are helpful when we think about waivers of liability and parental rights, because no parent is expecting to waive their right to sue for their child's death. They're expecting maybe to waive their right for my kid's leg was broken or his face got scratched or what have you. And so it's a whole different thing, especially in the framework of protection, where we're talking about a summer camp where you expect your children to be taken care of by trained counselors. It's no different in swim lessons. We expect the swim instructor or the lifeguard in an appropriate relationship, like a swim lesson or a water camp, to monitor our children and not have them drown. So that caregiver relationship creates a higher burden and duty of care than just, seeing someone at the pool. Another story that I provide updates in the June 24, 2026 newsletter is the Kitsilano Pool in British Columbia. There has been reports for the last 2 years about the pool not being used as much as it can be. So for context, the Kitsilano Pool did have a big renovation in 2023, 2024. So it only reopened in 2025. They had to spend several $1,000,000 to rehab this pool. It was leaking a tremendous amount of water. And so when it reopened in 2025, as best as I can understand, because I haven't been to the site myself, it's located in Vancouver, British Columbia. There is a certain amount of spaces that are allegedly left for drop-in swimmers, and then a large number of spaces are required to be booked online. So vestigial from COVID, where you had to book your spot for contact tracing, you had to provide your name, your contact info, and that's how you got in to swim. And this journalist who lives in British Columbia, I was following her a bit last summer, and she's still on this again this summer. She's alleging that the pool is basically empty, but showing as sold out online. And I don't have anybody else that I can use to confirm or deny what she's saying. She is posting video footage and photos, so take that as what you will. I'm not saying she's falsifying it, but I don't have any other sources to back this up. I haven't gotten onto a plane to Vancouver to check this out myself. The World Cup is on. The ticket prices to fly right now are not great. But this is something I wanted to stick with and follow throughout the summer, because I think this is part of a bigger problem we've seen with Vancouver aquatics in general, Vancouver Parks Board. I'm not here to shame people individually, but I think it does seem like the organizations within the city are experiencing major dysfunction and are not working as efficiently as they could be. I don't have the full story, in the sense I'm not embedded in the organization. I don't live in Vancouver. Why should I care? But Vancouver is a very large city in Canada. There's a lot of resources that are being allocated. And to have these big gaps for the average resident or ratepayer who wants to be able to go use the pool when there's all these other pools that have been shut down. Just a few days ago, the Supreme Court of British Columbia refused to hear the case. There were some residents that were fighting against the closure of the Olympic pool that's over 50 years old, that's going to be replaced with a 25-meter pool. I don't have any skin in the game in terms of I see both sides of the story. Should you have a 25? Should you have an Olympic 50? There's reasons to do one or the other. But there's just so much that doesn't seem to be working. And to have a big pool that anytime she's filmed it looks legitimately empty is definitely a concern for anybody who is passionate about aquatics and access, I think. The other update I want to give today is regarding Emilie Kiser. Kaiser, as in like Wilhelm, the German leader. I finally have her name correct. Um, you guys know the story. I've been following this since last May. Emilie Kiser was postpartum from the birth of her second child, 5 weeks. She went out to dinner with some friends. This was her first time leaving her house meaningfully after giving birth. By her accounts in this podcast, she was at the restaurant for 10 minutes when she received a call from her husband that her older son, 3-year-old Trigg, had been found in the pool and he was not breathing. And from there, as we understand, like filling in the blank, he was in hospital. And I would imagine, this is my speculation, he was taken off of life support for being submerged for a long period of time in the pool where his brain was deprived of oxygen and did not show the kind of electrical activity that is possible to sustain, life without long-term care or to perform activities of daily living. Emilie Kiser was a mom, social media influencer in Arizona. She took a break throughout the summer. She came back late summer, I think August or September. And I was a bit snarky in the beginning last summer, just in the way, I think I went along the ride. I didn't know her before this incident. I definitely went along the ride. I was swept in the public furor about allegedly, people told her allegedly that she should have had a pool fence, not a pool net, that she should have had door locks and door alarms. And unfairly to her, I was kind of swept in that public furor. And then she made a press release in the fall on social media, and then she slowly came back to work online social media. I've been checking in on her a little bit. I don't follow her, I'm not subscribed to her on TikTok or Instagram, so I just check in here or there. But then I started to see in the spring of 2026, she was really starting to share about water safety, drowning prevention, talking about ISR lessons, infant self-rescue, which I'm not a huge proponent of, but is not a bad thing to talk about, talking about water safety. And then this week, or maybe last week, she did her first long form podcast interview with Shetty, talking about the incident. And that really, for me, solidified what I said a few months ago, which is that I was completely wrong about, I was wrong. And I don't know her. So I was wrong in the beginning for not giving her the benefit of the doubt, for faulting her for not knowing better about water safety and drowning prevention. However, in the last few months that I've been following her, and now having listened to the entire hour-long podcast she did with Shetty, I am absolutely convinced that she will make this her life's work and that she will be a force of change in a way that traditional water safety and drowning prevention advocates cannot. So we can talk all we want about swim lessons. We can talk about having a booth at the county fair or doing education sessions for school kids in the classroom. But as I shared in an earlier newsletter that I will link down below, Emilie Kiser's audience across TikTok and Instagram, both in terms of the volume as well as the engagement and her profile since this incident, are able to make changes to water safety in a way that I respectfully, Life Saving Society or the Canadian Red Cross, we can't have that kind of impact that she can. So I give some of my observations from the podcast in the newsletter. It is a very, very emotional podcast. I would not encourage anybody who's experienced child loss or who is in, having a bad day, bad month, grief, depression, anything like that. Like, do not listen to this episode. It is extremely raw. I listened to it in a couple of chunks, 15 minutes at the gym, 10 minutes while driving, and that was plenty. I spaced it out. I don't feel that she should have to perform grief, but I think if you are looking for some sort of validation or confirmation that she's learned her lesson, which none of us should be looking for, but people are human, you will get that in this podcast. Right from the beginning, she is very clear that she takes personal accountability for not doing enough to protect her child, for her child suffering, for her not doing more, feeling responsible, feeling I can't restate her exact wording, but feeling like she was not a good parent. And she had some really interesting perspectives on her feeling about whether or not she should blame her husband who was home while she was out at a restaurant. And that's been one of the big comments between myself and my colleagues who we talk about this story throughout the last year. There's been a lot of, well, how could she ever forgive her husband? How could she ever live with this? She wouldn't have let this happen, but he did. And one of the things I found really interesting in her commentary on the podcast was talking about how yes, initially she said, I could hardly look at my husband, but she ended up forgiving him because my interpretation, reading between what she said and doesn't say, my interpretation is she says, well, it also could have happened on my watch, i.e., like we didn't have a pool fence, we only had a pool net. The reports are the pool net was pulled back for pool cleaning the next day. There were no door alarms. The child was accustomed to playing and bicycling around the pool. And then she also gets in a little bit into the fact that when she left the house to go to her dinner, her husband was settling the baby, defrosting breast milk to feed him, and that transition period I talk about, no different from the movie Home Alone, where Macaulay Culkin is left behind because there's just so much going on. It's such a unique circumstance. And so I just am really excited to see what Emilie Kiser is going to be doing. She has already done more respectfully than many families can manage to do. And many families who experience drowning, fatal or otherwise, they shouldn't have to perform grief. They shouldn't have to educate. They shouldn't have to relive their trauma extensively. The few that I follow on social media or I've talked to at conferences, like they have to have a very hard skin to be blamed by us spectators, the public, the audience, and it's not for everyone to do what she's doing. So I want to give tremendous credit. It is a invaluable podcast if you want to understand how this can happen. So I recall an influencer I worked with a number of years ago who I won't name. I had done some education with them regarding a pool that they were building in their dream home. And at the time it was so bizarre to me because I talked about water safety and drowning prevention, and they were so shocked about the statistics I provided. And they, as best as I could tell through social media, were very, knowledgeable and engaged parents. And yet here you have another case of a knowledgeable and engaged parent who herself says, I didn't know the risks. I didn't know the statistics. I thought I was educated and I wasn't. I made bad choices. I regret the net. Um, and she lives with that guilt every hour of every day, not having her child with her. So, yeah, I think to bring it back to the newsletter, if you have the desire to listen, it is an excellent interview or excellent editing, as I said. Emilie Kiser has obviously gotten to, I'm not saying she's healed. She says herself she's not healed, but she has some very good clarity. She says she's done a lot of work with professionals, and I think that's apparent because she has really good clarity on what she can do, what she can't do, what she should have done, what she couldn't have known. And I think that was really interesting because we rarely get this kind of depth in an interview with a parent who's gone through this kind of grief. And we can't expect most parents to put themselves forward like this. Jay Shetty does give her the opportunity to talk about the trauma associated with the helicopters, the people driving by her home, taking photographs, speculating the public nature of this, which is how I got connected to the story. I didn't know who she was. And then when People Magazine, US Weekly, Us Weekly, they start reporting, we all glom on. And I'm guilty of that too. But I'm excited to see kind of where she's going with this in terms of her willingness to share her memories, her experience. She stated she will never share her children ever again on social media. So she's set that boundary and she's not sharing everything, as she would say. She's sharing herself on her okay, good days, which doesn't mean she's not grieving, which doesn't mean she's fine. But I found it very interesting as a water safety professional, aquatic professional, even from a sociological perspective, just like a very, very good interview. Let's talk about the rest of the news stories from this week, and then we are going to get into the Camp Mystic final report. So, second half of the newsletter is always a combination of things that I've been reading and thinking. This first headline was really in my sphere of personal interest, where it says Sussex County lifeguards receive free skin cancer screenings. I literally every year for the last 7 or 8 years, I have been going to see a dermatologist with their little microscope, and they are always finding things for them to cut out of my skin. And earlier this week, on this year's batch of skin cutting, I had something come back which is not necessarily cancerous, but they do have to cut out more than the sample that they took. And so I speak as somebody, I'm an older millennial. I spent all my summers at a summer camp out in the sun. I did not wear sunscreen. Yes, I know better now. I knew better then, but you're young. You think it's not going to happen to me. I also am unlucky, according to my dermatologist, insofar as my dad was a redhead. I have some fair genes in me, but I am now on the skin cancer train, protection prevention train. That doesn't mean I'm looking like Anne Hathaway and wearing full length burkini swimsuit. I still love the sun when we go on cruises, but I'm applying, SPF 75 and I'm using a hat and I'm being sensible and I'm balancing between, yeah, I don't want to die of skin cancer, but I also want to enjoy my life. Where I'm going with this is I truly do feel that we in aquatics, especially outdoor aquatic industries, we need to be doing more. Australia knows that skin cancer is even a cause of death there. Huge rates of skin cancer in Australians, never mind whether they're swimmers or lifeguards, but just that outdoor lifestyle and being close to the sun at the equator. We are not doing enough, in my opinion, in aquatics. If you work at an outdoor pool, outdoor water park, I think this should be, not saying the skin screening has to be done, but there should be education in terms of policies regarding uniform, providing, like the big pump sunscreen, providing budget for hats and sunglasses. Some big American water parks do a really good job of this, but a lot of Canadian pools, in my opinion, were skirting by our minimum diligence. We're doing no education, no policy work. We're not providing sunscreen or uniforms or enforcement. I really think this is something we need to be talking about. So if you are doing skin cancer screenings, or as one lifeguard told me, his dermatologist said, take your own photos of your body each summer. If you're not, like, I'm at a situation where I need to get it checked every year or 6 months. You may not be at that point, but this is absolutely something that we need to be talking about sooner rather than later. Couple of other stories that on a quieter week we would be talking more about, but given the preponderance of stories this week, I can't give them as much time as they're honestly due. There was a death of a 9-year-old boy at a swimming summer camp. A lot of questions with that. I haven't dug into that story, but that's something that I'm following. There was a number of legal judgments this week, one in the UK regarding a woman who was only fined $4,000 for two disabled adults who drowned in a boating incident. That one was really, really awful. I mean, they're all awful, but really, when we see that a fatality is only worth £2,000, like that's just offensive. There was litigation regarding a teen sorry, I should say there was a settlement regarding a teen who drowned at a country club. I'm forgetting the details because I haven't opened up the article since I wrote the newsletter on Wednesday and I'm recording this on Saturday. But as I recall, one of the arguments in this particular incident was that there either weren't enough lifeguards on duty or it was just the quality of training for lifeguards. Also, this week, I've been a bit surprised by the public reaction to the child who drowned in Medicine Hat, Alberta last week. I shared that incident. It was at an outdoor water body, kind of like a man made lake, also on a school trip. Every child drowning is sad in its own way. But the way the community has responded to this has been a bit interesting to watch sociologically because drowning happens all the time everywhere in Canada, including Alberta. Earlier in the week, there was an industrial drowning death in northern Alberta. A crane fell into a river. That person also drowned. And I just find it curious that, yes, children, it's sad, but these things are always happening. So it's been interesting to see the community reaction to that. Another story this week that was really awful was an investigation is underway after a child was wearing a life jacket, but they didn't have the crotch strap connected. And I cannot even tell you the hundreds of times when I used to work teaching swim lessons, parent and taught, or summer camps would show up to the pool, school lessons would show up to the pool, and you're having everybody help put the kids in life jackets and people are hesitant to reach and grab the straps between a child's legs because it looks bad or the optics are bad. But that crotch strap is absolutely critical when a child is smaller or between weights. That life jacket can lift up and their arms can even shoot out, or if it's not zippered or clipped. We need to be telling our staff, our helpers, our attendants, our lifeguards, our swim instructors, our parents, anybody who's helping at the pool this summer, we need to do that bottom strap. It's not optional. It's not, the PFD is not being used in accordance with manufacturer's specifications and safety requirements if we don't do that. Also, the big story this week, like there was just so many things this week. The Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool in Washington, D.C. I have not been following this closely. My colleague Tim Auerhan at the Aquatic Council, he's been on so many different news broadcasts the last couple of weeks talking about this. First, it was the coating, then it was the algae, then the allegation of vandalism, then. What I said in the newsletter is this: I don't think that this is a bigger issue than simply an old swimming pool or an old basin with old, slow recirculation that is very shallow. It's going to get very warm. There's going to be a lot of contamination in terms of it's a shallow body of water in a heavily touristed area of Washington, D.C., where kids are going to jump in up to their ankles, dogs are going to jump in, pollen from the cherry blossoms is going to go in, ducks might land. And if this water is even chlorinated and recirculated like a pool to minimize algae, it is an older structure, right? Like it's almost 100-year-old pool. And in speaking to my husband, who was posted to Arlington National Cemetery almost 5 years in his Army career, he can tell me anecdotally that he'd seen the Lincoln Memorial Pool with algae during his time posted there in the 80s. So if we fast forward now to 2026 and the coating that was applied was a darker color, meaning it's darker water, warms up faster, Then we add in a reticence to use high levels of chlorine to kill algae conclusively because we don't want to damage the new coating. And maybe the new coating was not given enough time to cure, so it's not fully waterproof or not fully working the way it's supposed to. All of these things are contributing to the algae being hard to get rid of. The pool surface flaking, because also maybe it wasn't applied correctly. Maybe the surface wasn't prepared correctly. Maybe the surface wasn't allowed to dry properly. There's a compressed timeline from a very demanding boss or client who wants this ready to go for America's 250th on July 4th. There's just so many things that make this like a very logical, easy mistake. Oh, and I didn't even throw in, let's say they didn't purge the lines, like water was trapped underneath in the pipes while they were resurfacing the basin because it's an older system and it may not have the mechanism to purge the lines fully. All of these things contribute to a very standard set of pool operating problems that would lead to algae or promote the growth of algae or promote poor water quality. And it's an old pool, right? I think it was built in the 20s or 30s. Like it's going to be old, small pipes, long turnover, not the latest modern conveniences that we would put on a new decorative fountain. I I think I've referenced a few episodes ago that I heard a podcast a number of years ago that really stuck with me. And it was an architect basically saying we put chillers on decorative reflecting pools and fountains now because they're so hard to manage, especially with dark stone and shallow water. They could easily breed bacteria and algae. So that is more than you probably care about, to say nothing of the hydrogen peroxide, to say nothing of the allegations of vandalism. Like, you could do a whole episode on that, but it's honestly not an interesting topic to me. I'm not trying to be un-American. It's just not relevant to my life until I went to a baseball game with my cousin on Tuesday night, and his girlfriend asked me, what's the deal with the Lincoln pool algae. And I thought, okay, I actually need to talk about this now because this is what I want our newsletter to be. I want our newsletter to be relevant to those of you who want to be able to participate in conversation about our industry, whether it's with your friends or family or colleagues. And this is a story that's not going anywhere. Couple other articles I shared in the back half of the newsletter. Snapchat is unveiling glasses like Meta. So we have yet another entry into the market for being concerned about privacy and recording others and photography in private settings. I shared a couple of different articles, one regarding a child who drowned during a World Cup watch party, which was really sad. I shared some resources from Kate Connell at Hydro Apps. She did a great blog post I've linked to regarding lifeguard enrichment ideas that are easy to implement in 2026. Few other drowning stories that unfortunately are pretty run of the mill, right? Every week I'm sharing drowning stories and I'm reading hundreds of them. I'm skimming the headlines for hundreds in my Google News alerts, and I'm picking the ones that I think are informative. And two California students were swept out to sea and drowned fatally while they were napping on the beach. Right? If you don't know about high tide, low tide, you're not far enough away from the uh, coastline. Right? Just a terrible story. A few other ones, friend drowns jumping into the water to save another. Uh, an article pertaining to new pools that are opening at high schools in New York City, where I'm continuing that thread that we've been seeing over the last couple of months about access to high school pools outside of operating hours. How can we use these spaces in terms of joint use agreements in communities that don't have enough pools? As well as some initiatives across the US in terms of free swim lessons, free admission to pools, micro shifting employees who flex their work schedule to have like on and off periods throughout the day. So all of these are actually really interesting topics to me that I would talk about further, except I do want to spend the next little bit of time talking about the Camp Mystic final report. We are going to be taking a break next week in terms of we are not going to have a newsletter for the July 1st, which is Canada Day here in Canada. And also July 4th next week falls on Saturday. So I recognize a lot of aquatic professionals will be taking part of the week off or a few extra days off. So we will be back in basically 10 days from now on July 8th with our next full newsletter. Let's spend a little bit of time now looking at this final report on Camp Mystic. I don't know about you, but these AI tools are driving me a little bit bonkers. I was reading some architectural plans the other day and it kept offering to summarize, like, this is a long document. Can we summarize it for you? And I thought, how do you summarize architectural plans? Like, I was 150 pages of architectural plans. Like, I just don't get it. But that is the world we live in right now. I'm trying to make this bigger so we can actually see it. So I'm going to share this a little bit on the screen. I'm not going to go page by page. This is a 117 or 115 page report. This is absolutely devastating. So trigger warning for this report if you read it for the next 15 minutes, whatever it takes for me to talk about this case. As I said earlier in the video, and I'll link to this report, obviously, in the description down below. The thing about this report that really gets me, and this is not going to be a sustainable view. Let me start with some of my general comments about this report. So the report is very well written. It is very easy to understand. It is very succinct despite, hundreds of hours interviewing hundreds of people, touring sites, photos, what have you. It is, let's say it's 115 pages, but of that, there are at least 28 pages of in memoriam for the individuals who lost their lives. There are also many maps and graphics. So I would say this is only about 75 pages and it's double spaced, 1.5 spaced. Like, it's pretty manageable to read in an hour. There is a lot of facts in this report that I think are relevant for aquatic professionals to be aware of. I think this full report is worth your time if you have an interest in Camp Mystic, if you want to know more, or at the end of this video, if I've piqued your interest, this is something I genuinely feel is worth reading. I have a personal interest in this as a former summer camp counselor and camper. My husband will tell you I also just love reading disaster reports. I watched the Titan submersible testimony on the US Coast Guard channel. I read aviation disaster reports, maritime disaster reports, train disaster reports. I don't think you have to have that weird niche interest to want to read this. There is so many things. It is a terrible nightmare as you're reading it going, it can't possibly get worse, and it does. They also provide valuable context in this report. So if you are not somebody who has spent any time at summer camp, there is still a lot you can learn because they provide a lot of background. So I'm going to go a little bit through it page by page, as I would with any document that I review with pool operator students. So I will pause on the things that I think are relevant that you might want to come back to if you're printing this out, but we're not going to go through every single page. I also really appreciate that this report talks about it is not the final word. There is still more information that could come out, more investigation that is worthwhile. I mean, something as simple as Seal Stewart, one of the little girls, is still missing. If her body, her remains will ever be found, it may further illuminate certain aspects of the disaster that we can't know at this point in time. And also through the legal process by which many families or victims are suing the Camp Mystic owners and directors, that disclosure and discovery is going to further um, inform what we know and what we don't know. As I'm going through my commentary on this final report, I do want to give a little bit of background on myself as a summer camp counselor, because as I go through and I speculate or I provide my personal opinion, it is very much informed because I understand, in my opinion, exactly how some of these things could have happened. I'm not here to justify them, but having been myself a summer camp camper for, I believe it was 6 years, I was a camper at a girls' sleepaway camp. I'm not going to be more specific or name the property, but a very storied legacy institution that is celebrated over 100 years, very similar in style and setup and price point and things. I can see exactly how some of these habits, these too big to fail, as I said earlier, routines, this complacency because you've been doing things for a certain length of time successfully, you're well regarded in the industry, in the community. At that same summer camp, which I had an incredibly positive experience as a camper for 5 or 6 years, I then went on to be a leader in training, a counselor in training, a full counselor, and an activity head. I was there for almost 10 years, which sounds like a long time, but I have friends who were second, third generation who went there for 15 years, some who went almost 20 years, would go back as, part-time staff or the nurse or what have you. And I have friends who have signed their own girls up to go. It is that, as I shared when I talked about the Texas Monthly articles about Camp Mystic, I profiled those earlier this year. It's almost like, any college or sorority where there's a sort of, you know, you drink the Kool-Aid, you're into it. And I had a very positive experience at my camp, both as a camper and as a counselor. But I can also say now, with the hindsight perspective of working in swimming pools and recreation and extensive training in the ICS, the Incident Command System, working in mock EOCs, as well as a health and safety consultant and auditor, I can see gaps in the things that I was trained to do and not trained to do, simply on the basis of, well, we've been doing it this way forever. Everybody knows how to do that, or everybody knows what we would do, or we don't need to figure it out because that's never going to happen. And I'm not saying that the camp I attended was negligent. At the time I was there was over 20 years ago, and I don't remember everything I was trained on or everything that we did. But I could absolutely believe in 2025, when this incident occurred at Camp Mystic, also reading between the lines of the accounts in this report, that there were many, many things that wouldn't have changed for 40 years, 50 years, based on personality and preferences. And yes, sometimes cutting corners out of laziness or to save money, as well as also the cult of the personality of certain leaders and owners. So this takes you through background on the physical location of the camp. Sorry, I need to use my scrolling here. I'm going to use these down here. And I'm going to try and toggle back and forth. And so I do need to prepare you that the first part here is in memoriam to all of the campers, which is absolutely heartbreaking, but completely appropriate. And I'm glad that they have centered the campers here. And they do give also credit, which I think is appropriate, to Dick Eastland, the co-camp director owner, later in the document. I know there's been a lot of animosity, rightly, between the families of the children who lost their lives, that the man who died, he should not have died. He also died tragically, but as we'll see in the report, he was responsible for a lot of things that should not have happened. And I think there is a lot of very legitimate animosity towards him on the part of families. And I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, claims of negligence are valid. Scrolling past these stories is not saying that their lives are not worth remembering. I would encourage you to read some of their stories. The girls that were lost are also profiled as part of Heavens 27. There is a nonprofit foundation. They're actively engaged on social media, which is where I've been learning about the girls and their families and their different fundraising initiatives, memorial funds. It is just absolutely devastating to read about these little 8 and 9-year-old girls, and then the 2 camp counselors who were both going off to college in the fall. Um, they didn't deserve to die in this incident. This incident may not have been preventable, but it was absolutely foreseeable. And the background that I read in the Texas Monthly articles a few months ago is a bit more detailed than is covered in this report, because I think this report really focuses on the facts. And I don't know the legislative process in Texas for an investigation like this or an inquest, but it makes sense objectively that you're going to focus on the facts of what we do know happened, what we do know occurred, as opposed to speculating as they do in the Texas Monthly articles. There were catastrophic floods at Camp Mystic in the 1970s and the 1980s, including the wife of one of the family members that owns and runs the camp having to be evacuated by helicopter. So although it's been 40 years since that happened, it was foreseeable that flooding could be that significant, at least in the memory of the owners in 70s and 80s. Like I think it was 78 and 87. If you go back even further, which they do in this report, the floodplain, the zoning, flooding that occurred, like catastrophic flooding that occurred back in the 20s and 30s, has also been documented. So they don't get into that much in this report. They do give numbers. So the flooding that occurred last year, July 4th of 2025, they believe the flooding, well, I guess when it becomes defined as flooding, was starting at 10 feet in height, which is huge if we're talking especially about little children. And then it crested, it stopped, and the water level started to recede at 37.5 feet, which is not a swimmable depth, to say nothing of the speed of the water, the debris in water. If you don't know much about flooding, I used to work at a municipality that experienced catastrophic flooding right before I got there in 2016, and flood training, EOC training, emergency operation command, ICS, incident command system training was mandatory for even me as a pool supervisor for the organization. And where I wanted to go with this is just saying, I don't even know that the average water safety professional really thinks about flash flooding, drowning in your car being swept away, immense flooding that we saw when I lived in New Mexico, Texas, in the desert areas. You get flash flooding in the desert. It's unbelievable if you're not used to it. But the owners of this summer camp, Dick and Tweety Eastland, at least back to the 70s, were very aware of the flooding that could occur. And even when they go into this report, the mapping of the area, the zones that the camp was on, the owner, Dick Eastland's individual interest in participating in flood education, like turn around, like turn your car around, don't drown, don't drive in high flood waters. His own personal awareness on this topic makes it even less congruous that he didn't do anything. And you'll see repeatedly, I used to think it was by omission, like he didn't know, he was unaware, this all happened in the middle of the night. But this report very clearly lays out that the camp co-director and owner, Dick Eastland, from basically 11 o'clock at night, and this is me commenting on the report from my memory, so if I'm slightly off in the exact time frame, but basically, from the time he was going to go to bed, watching the news, from 11 o'clock at night, the forensic investigation of his phone shows that he was constantly checking weather reports. He was checking his own personal domestic weather app with his own weather station, that he was checking social media and radar. It's not the case that he went to bed and heard a text alert of a flash flood warning at 1:30 in the morning, and it woke him up, and then he took action. The forensic investigation indicated in this report clearly shows that he was active on his phone. He was actively looking at these things and then chose to do nothing. There are repeated junctures when we get to the timeline where there were repeated opportunities for him to have done something sooner, and he did not. We don't know why he did not, whether he was elderly and not fit to make that decision, whether he was in shock, panicked, didn't know what to do, didn't believe what was happening. It's very clear to me that his involvement, and then the not the code of silence, this is not the mafia, but his strict obedience to being the leader of the organization, even though he and his wife were transitioning to one of their sons taking over. There's just so much in terms of lack of chain of command, lack of leadership, even when it wasn't him there, who's going to take over if he's not there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go through the report in a little bit of a strategic way. So they start off with the basic background, and they have some, how did we get to page? We got to 35 because we scrolled past the girls in memoriam. Sorry. So there's a little bit of background here on the camp, and you'll notice this helpful bolding. The inadequacy of advanced emergency planning is a big theme that is covered in this report. So not only did the camp counselors only arrive 2 days before the campers, so they only had 2 days of training, there was, quote, emergency training, but the emergency training was on a single piece of paper that was meant to be the emergency procedure, air quotes, because that's insufficient, for a variety of emergency circumstances, ranging from fire, flooding, fatality, what have you. And you'll see that piece of paper replicated later in the report, and it's basically shelter in place, wait for instructions. They did not receive training. And so there was not training because there was no plan. There was no procedure. The binder at the front office, or the binders given to the staff in the cabins, the camp counselors, was clearly insufficient. And I could say this as a camp counselor and also someone who writes procedures for pools. You cannot have a single piece of paper for one pool and multiple incidents. Never mind, I believe it's a 750-acre summer camp with over 550 campers and counselors at the one site. All of this flooding happened at the Guadalupe campsite. So they have 2 locations at Camp Mystic, the Legacy Guadalupe River location, and then the Cypress Creek newer location opened in 2020. Nothing happened over there. And for what little information is provided to us, the camp, the son and the wife who managed that particular area of camp arguably were more vigilant, even though nothing actually happened over there. But there is no question that there was no advanced planning. There was no advanced directives in terms of what the staff were trained to do, how they were trained to do it. There was no emergency evacuation kits. There's no go bags. There's no handouts or clipboards. There's no procedure. Very, very clear. And it's not just for flooding. I think that's what I thought initially, is like, oh, they didn't have anything for flooding, but they had a plan for, like, a campfire starts to burn the grass and they have to evacuate because there's a fire, or a drowning incident. By all accounts, there was like no documentation or preparedness for staff to be trained on or to know what to do for any of this. And it's not even just the camp counselors, it's also the other staff that this report goes through. It's also like the security guard, the office staff, the camp coordinators. It's also the other children of the camp directors who are on site. It's also, egregiously, in my opinion, the grounds staff and the kitchen staff. And this is where I'm saying my commentary is informed by my own personal experience. At my summer camp, as a camper and as a counselor, we were taught not to engage with the kitchen staff or the groundskeeping staff. It's not meant to be classist. It was a security protocol that the young children at the camp, they don't chat with or talk to or socialize with the ground staff, the maintenance staff, the kitchen staff. They are meant to be treated as though they're invisible. I understand that from a child safety protocol, especially when you have male staff at a girls' camp. But to say that there's no participation in an emergency like an evacuation when you need all the adults present, you will see in the report that they talk explicitly about how the Polish kitchen staff, the Mexican groundskeeping staff, they were available, but they did not themselves feel they could participate because they had been so explicitly told not to engage or interact with campers at any point. And I would assume, based on what's not being said, that they would have gotten in trouble if they had. And so they literally did not help, nor did they know how to help or what to do, especially if English was not their first language. It was a barrier to communication. It's the middle of the night. This is taking place 2, 3, 4 a.m. It's pitch black, pouring rain, loud. There's just so many things about the lack of preparedness, but you'd think even if you don't want people to normally help, they should be available as adults to help with young children if there's a real emergency. And there's a chart later in this report that's particularly egregious. And it basically says that there is, almost 39 adults, and they're not even counting like the 17 or 18-year-old counselors who might have some of them been technically adults, but some of them were so ill trained, ill supported. You cannot blame an 18-year-old first year counselor with 13 or 14 children. Like the ratios that I saw mentioned in this document are egregious, in my opinion, for such a high profile, high cost summer camp. My summer camp was very expensive. Almost 20 years ago, a month at my summer camp was almost $4,000 Canadian, but we had a ratio in our cabins of like 4, max 5 campers to 2 counselors. And you'll see in this report that they talk about 13 and 14 8-year-olds left with 2 17 or 18-year-old first year counselors with no support, homesick kids, bedwetting kids, scared kids, throw in a thunderstorm and flash flooding. It's incredible that more children did not perish, especially when we talk later about the rec hall and 100 people on the balcony of the rec hall, which thankfully did not collapse. Reading further from the executive summary at the top of the report, which is also an easy way to dive into this report if you don't want to read the whole thing, but the inadequacy of storm preparation. So there's a lot of energy spent on the lack of communication internally, but I don't think respectfully the executive summary covers it enough. I read this and went, yeah, we know they didn't acknowledge the storm alert that was sent out by the weather people at 1:30 a.m. Who would have? But then later in the detailed report, I think it better explains why it's so bad. So initially, the media really gravitated and latched upon, oh, well, there was this text message sent at 1:30 in the morning saying that flash flooding is imminent. Not that it might happen, but it is imminent, get to higher ground. And I didn't put a lot of stock in that because at summer camp, you're not allowed to have your phone in your bunk. You don't necessarily have good signal. That's been identified at this site. They did not have good signal. And it's 1:30 in the morning. So if you're like me, you have your notifications turned off. You wouldn't have heard it unless it was like an amber alert where it's got that like, you're not going to have heard it. So I didn't put too much stock in the inadequacy of storm preparation. Having read the report, I now understand that there were weather forecast, weather storm warnings almost 2 days before. There was heightened weather alerts on July 3rd during business hours. So I believe it was like 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And at that stage, anybody in the business administration of the camp had access to that information, which then could have been passed to the entire camp staff via staff meeting or cabin or department meeting, right? It was not a surprise. There was heightened alert. There was arguably misty gray weather. And then later we get into the specifics of how egregious it was that some people did receive alerts. Some people did know, but that information wasn't shared. And then the smoking gun for me was that Dick Eastland had a personal weather station. So, something you might get from, in the olden days, they used to have those magazines with like, what was the store? Brookstone at the mall. So he had a more advanced but residential grade weather station, sensor that you can install outside of your house with an app and specific weather and environmental conditions at your home. We're not just talking about like an analog rain tube. He had an actual digital weather station and app and tracking, and the forensic evidence shows that he was on his phone continuously from like 11:30 at night. He also participated in having certain parts of the property recategorized after the floodplains were redrawn in the early 2010s. He also participated in education and awareness regarding these floodplains. Like there's just so much that he knew. It's inexcusable. Even in the night of, if you had known at 2 o'clock in the business day, hey, tonight we should evacuate, you could have done it so much sooner. Or, hey, we should move people out of these cabins to let's have a sleepover in the dance hall, or in the, like we would do that all the time at camp. We can relocate people to higher ground for fun sleepover. It's just so egregious to me. But let's keep going. Repeatedly, I think it's also important to say they don't stress this in the report, but it comes to mind in relation to the public reporting I've read elsewhere. The individual actions of the camp counselors is why more children did not die. Literally, you'll read in this report how there were 2 sets of camp counselors who left their cabin at 1:30 in the morning. Maybe it was 2:30. They left their cabins to go to the front office to say, hey, we're concerned about flooding. There's water coming into our cabin. What do we do? And Dick Eastland, one of the co-camp directors, and the son drove them back to their cabins and said, you'll be fine, shelter in place. It's that type of dismissiveness and actions that we will never have accountability for, and other instances where people were told to shelter in place and the camp counselors like were actively told on walkie-talkies or like by a person through the window, shelter in place. And thank God the camp counselors actively disregarded that directive from their supervisor that caused children to survive. And that is one of the most traumatizing things if you read this report in the last half is it goes cabin by cabin, and it doesn't name the counselors, thankfully, but it goes cabin by cabin and says, 17-year-old counselor with 9 children the age of 7 had to use a rock to smash out the screen to push them out the window because the pressure on the door was too strong, right? Like just really, really egregious. And that's the other piece here about the failure to timely evacuate in the executive summary. In the timeline that we'll get to, including photographic evidence of the boats being collected by the Mexican groundskeepers and having time to stop and take a photo, there would have been plenty of time to evacuate multiple junctures. Not just when the flooding started at 1:30 in the morning, not just when it got worse at 2:30 in the morning, not even when it got worse at 3 in the morning or 3:15, but to say nothing of the night before, the day before, or when the first alert went out at 1:30, right? There's just so many missed opportunities here that make this even more upsetting. The PA system is also, I think, appropriately dealt with in this report. In some of the public articles I read, people put too much stock, respectfully, in the PA system. My camp did not have a PA system at the time I was there from 1997 to 2006. Other camps I've worked at in aquatics have had PA systems, and I'm sure we had a bullhorn, and I'm sure there probably was a way that I didn't know about that they could, and probably now they definitely have a PA system. But I'm not aware of many camps that would want to, quote, disturb the quiet with technology of a PA system in the middle of the night unless it was an emergency. This was an emergency, and by all accounts, there's no evidence that the PA system wasn't working because it was up on high poles. Why didn't they use it in the middle of the night? And I think that that is not a huge area that we should be focusing our attention, because through willful ignorance or shock, or maybe there was some sort of, elderly brain fog, pre-Alzheimer's, something like that. At no point did Dick Eastland, who was the primary leader of the camp through everything we read in this report, or did anybody under him feel the autonomy to use the PA system in the middle of the night to warn. I think that the report gives this the appropriate justification, which is this is not the smoking gun that would have saved everyone, which is what I think some journalists have indicated in reporting. There's no guarantee the PA system would have worked. If the staff didn't have training, what would you have said on the PA system? Like, flee up ground? Like, there's no directive, there's no command they could have given. And then further, it may have caused further panic or confusion. I'm not saying that might not have been worth it, but I think that this report gets it right, that the PA system was not the linchpin that other people suggest it is. One of the things about the report that is a bit confusing, the report does its best to indicate what is bubble in, what is twins 1, what is twins 2, what is wiggle in. All of the cabins and buildings have names, no different from my camp growing up, and that makes complete sense to me at my camp. There's no maps, you just know what everything is called. But with the exception of Bubble Inn, which is the catastrophic cabin with the littlest girls that we know, all 13 perished with their camp counselors, it is a bit hard to follow throughout the report. The same as the Eastland family. Dick and Tweety Eastland were the primary owners and directors. They have 3 sons who were alive at the time of the incident. They all have the last name Eastland. They all have wives or partners or extended family members and children at the site. So it starts to get a bit confusing at times, who's who in the zoo, so to speak. The last piece that is also, in my opinion, not adequately covered in the executive summary is the degree to which they botched the incident management after it happened or as it was happening. So if the fatalities are believed to have happened around 3:45 and 4 o'clock, and the flooding started to recede around 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m., the communication with families and campers and children and caregiving of the campers until they were picked up, I mean, is unbelievably shocking, and is unfortunately where the lack of accountability, apologizing for getting any of that wrong, or taking any accountability, which is where I kind of latched on in Instagram stories. Those of you who follow me on Instagram the last couple months, with the public testimony, like at no point substantively has the family said, we're sorry, we're wrong, and or we did a bad job, we let you down, we failed. And from a legal perspective, I understand why they wouldn't say that for accountability reasons, for insurance reasons. But I would agree with a lot of the public commentary that the family wouldn't stop pursuing their legal claims, but would feel a lot better if somebody just said, we screwed up, right? That goes a long way in customer service, in tragedy. And only if you see every single thing they did wrong the morning of, do you understand why their mind or their mindset doesn't think, oh, we should also apologize, because they did so much more wrong after it happened. It's just like, it gets so much worse. So this first section talks about summer camps in the Texas Hill Country on the Guadalupe River and Kerr County. So if you've never been to a residential overnight summer camp, if summer camp wasn't part of your growing up culture or your family's history, you may find this section interesting. The thing that I found shocking was that this camp quite literally is in Flash Flood Alley. Sorry, I zoomed out. So it was helpful to have this illustration to truly understand that, yes, Camp Mystic, which has been around for 100 years, literally sits on a floodplain. And they go through the the Upper Guadalupe River Authority education video that Dick Eastland was a part of, who was, I believe, chairman or president of that volunteer group up until his death, which makes it even more shocking that he had so little preparation in place at his own business, at his own summer camp, except that I would imagine it's that willful ignorance of we've been running this camp for 50 years. We're great at what we do. Your children are safe here. We'll take your money. They'll have a great experience. And yet that doesn't correlate to modern 21st century child and safety protection requirements. Like, yes, you don't necessarily want to move your whole camp. There's history and legacy in that land, but you can move the cabins away from the river. You can move them uphill. By all accounts, the Cypress Lake location and other buildings up the hill were completely unaffected. Why would you put the youngest campers closest to the river? It's shocking, right? Absolutely shocking. So they go through the history of flooding in this area, and this is the level of detail. This is more detail than what I spoke to earlier, but it includes in recent memory of the camp director who was in charge at the time of this incident, large scale flooding in 1978, in 1987, including fatalities in the area, if not at their camp specifically. Then, as background, they go through the legislation for summer camps in the state of Texas, and they are inspected by what I've heard called DISHES, Department of something, Safety and Human Services, that they get an annual inspection to operate, food safety laws, safety preparedness. I was a bit perplexed that that inspection happened on July 2nd, 2025. The same inspector who inspected them the previous year was also there and gave them a pass. And that has been one of the big points of contention in the public. Why does the word keep escaping me? Not inquests, but the public testimony and the Senate hearings regarding this incident is this is my speculation. I don't think the inspector was like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I'm going to pass you when you're deficient. I think, based on my experience with deficient swimming pools, a health inspector walks into a big, huge, impressive facility that's been open for 40 years. And this comes from experience, a client I fired a few years ago. And they're not mentally prepared to find deficiencies because it's too big to fail. How could such a big, prominent, well-regarded, public-facing aquatic facility have anything wrong? People would have commented or things would have happened, but nobody said anything. And so I would imagine it's the same thing. You show up to a summer camp where people pay $10,000 to go for a month, that's been around for 100 years, that is the backbone of society for certain demographics and sororities and colleges and certain socioeconomic strata of women in Texas. You're not expecting to find, for example, cockroaches in the kitchen, or you're not expecting to find, for example, neither of these are real things I'm alleging, a sex offender on staff. You're just not expecting that. You're expecting the best of the best, creme de la creme. They're going to hire the best people for the job, the best facilities, the best amenities, the best training. And that doesn't seem to be the case here, right? Gaps were definitely present that should have been caught. However, in fairness to the inspector, they only have so much time. They're often overworked and underpaid. And I've seen the same thing here in Alberta with my health inspectors. They do the best that they can, but they don't have 4 hours to look at everything. They pick an area of focus, and it is possible for deficient facilities to willfully hide, which is not what I'm alleging happened here, but also just what binder did they open today? Which clipboard did they check? They didn't see something that they should have, but there's only so much time in the visit. So one of the parties who is also responsible in this report, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because I think it's only a contributing factor. It's not a causal factor. There is some complaint in this document that the Kerr County, like the local rural county staff, were not as up to speed on emergency preparedness requirements as they should have been. There's a whole diatribe about an emergency official who was sick in bed and didn't designate an alternate, and then people tried to call them and they were sick and they didn't answer the phone and they didn't see rain outside. Like, that's not good, but I don't think that removes the responsibility of the business, the camp owners themselves, to seek out their own individual information. Like if I'm going to drive from Okotoks to Banff, it's not, Parks Canada's responsibility to text me that there's a snowstorm in Banff. I'm going to go online and I'm going to check the webcams, the traffic cameras. I'm going to check the weather report. I'm going to use my senses and look outside if it's snowing. I'm not relying on public officials to inform me. Arguably, Kerr County is a rural area with limited infrastructure. There is still state of Texas, national weather reporting, and then all of the individual resources that Dick Eastland and the camp owners had access to in their network of, uh, local and regional businesses that could also assist them. So I'm going to skip over this section because I don't find it that interesting or relevant personally, but there were some gaps in communication for sure, leadership and failure, possibly also enforcement. They then also talk about some of the other consequences in the area. So in addition to the 28 people who drowned fatally at Camp Mystic, 27 children, basically 18 and under, one adult male, Dick Eastland. There were another basically almost 100 people who drowned in the area, or rather, I should say 107 people drowned in that area in terms of that incident. It was the worst flash flooding that had happened in a long, long time. So that's some historical background. And you'll also start to see that this document is also significantly shortened by these references. So each page does have information that is worth reading, but we're not talking about more than, I would say, 500 or 700 words on each page. Then it gets into the procedural process in terms of the hearings, the committees that were formed last year, 2025, their findings that came out, and the legislation that has already changed in terms of camp safety. And then it goes into the process of the current report in terms of the people who were interviewed, the mapping, the photography. All of this process is laid out as a historical document so that you can refer to kind of the details that they went into. And the approval of this report, which happened on June 18th, which was basically last week. Then we get into some geography of Camp Mystic, and I've looked at the maps and I understand what I need to understand in terms of the placement of Bubble Inn and Twins 1, where a bunch of the children were that died close to the river. But I'm not going to try and dive into this because it does get very confusing in terms of the characters involved. Like I said, there's a lot of Eastlands, but the main thing that is highlighted here is that Camp Mystic, the original site on the Guadalupe River, the primary focus of this incident where everything happened, whereas the Cypress Lake, like Camp 2, the secondary location that was recently developed to deal with their wait lists, to deal with demand for camper spots, opened in 2020, but did not experience flooding. However, it was also cut off communication-wise due to a creek. So all of the background is given here, as well as the history of the two different sections. So the main incidents occurred in the flats, right? The flat areas by the river, the lower ground areas, they give elevation at the end of the report, whereas Senior Hill did not experience flooding. And a lot of the buildings that were on that hill were, I won't say perfectly fine, but they did not sustain the same damage or risk or threat as the lower buildings like Bubble Inn, Twins 1, Twins 2, Giggle Box, and the Wiggle Inn. So there's just some good background here. I wish there were photos. I'm sure there's a reason they don't have photos because the buildings are destroyed and they're still crime sites. Like a lot of these, you've probably seen some of the footage. It's devastating and horrific to see the appearance of these flooded areas. I'm sure there's a reason there's no photos, but photos really would have helped. So one of the things that was new to me in reading this report was talking about how in March of 2011, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they revised the flood mapping in Kerr County, and that map placed most of the residential cabins and central facilities of the Guadalupe River camp within a special flood hazard area, with several structures situated within the regulatory floodway of the South Fork of the Guadalupe River. Beginning in 2013, Camp Mystic engaged the federal letter of map amendment process through which a property owner may submit certified survey and engineering data in an attempt to demonstrate that an identified structure sits above the base flood elevation and was erroneously included in the hazard area. FEMA approved Camp Mystic's submissions, removing approximately 15 camp structures from the area in 2013. I have opinions, and it's only speculation. I can't substantiate anything. But I would imagine that you would want your camp structures removed from a floodplain for insurance purposes. Who is going to insure your property if it's in a floodplain? I'm not suggesting the surveyors or the engineers lied, but I have seen lots of professionals that they will agree with a desired conclusion for the right funding, or they just think nothing's ever going to happen. They're willing to take the professional risk in terms of the payment for this job. So I'm not alleging that Camp Mystic misrepresented what happened, but I do find it really concerning that no buildings were actually moved. Like, why not actually move the building? You don't have to move the camp. You can move the cabin and still use the camp. Or, I mean, and I don't think this is a hindsight thing. I think this is a common sense thing. If you were told in 2011 that your camper cabins are in the floodplain, why not spend some time and build in proper emergency procedures? Spend a summer or spend an off season, winter, spring, building emergency protocols, creating staff training plans, adding infrastructure like alarms or sensors to account for that. Because I'm sure insurance would have also appreciated that. Why just fix the issue in a way that obviously didn't matter? Then and when I say didn't matter, did not prevent this disaster from happening. Like, it was clearly in a floodplain. Then there is some background on camp culture. So if you never went to summer camp, you may find this information beneficial in terms of the activities that the children are doing, the day-to-day behavior, the culture, what the attitude was of the people who attended this camp. Then they went into the permanent staff. So permanent staff being year-round, owners, managers on site, not camp counselors who would be hired each year, or kitchen staff who would be hired each year, for example. Who was responsible for what? It's not so much the job description as who was doing what, and it tells a bigger picture about how Dick Eastland was really described in the report as large and in charge, and really the main absolutist figure, right, in charge of the facility. Goes into some history about the Cypress Lake location, and then some important statements like, despite his director title, Edward still considered Dick to be in charge of the Guadalupe River camp. And this speaks to the transition I can't adequately summarize here. In the report, though, it talks about how Dick and Tweety, they were getting elderly, they were taking a step back, they were starting to transition. One son and wife were going to take care of Cypress Lake, another son and wife were going to take care of Guadalupe River, the original site. But that didn't happen in practice. Any of the basic procedures that did exist were updated to account for a change in leadership. Oh, well, Dick's not here. Dick's not in charge. Who's doing what? There is an absence of leadership structure, chain of command, scope of responsibility. That is very clear throughout this document, to say nothing of what can seem, nobody says bullying behavior in this document, but like very clear micromanaging and very clear, it's my decision and that's final. That ultimately led, in my opinion, to people doing nothing because nobody wanted to get in trouble for doing the wrong thing, even though people died because nobody took action, right? I'm not saying they stood around and twiddled their thumbs, but people, I think, were scared to take action based on who's in charge and who's not. They also take you through the other cast of characters. There is an in memoriam here for Dick Eastland. It takes you through the other pertinent cast of characters, some of whom I've already mentioned, how There was a gatekeeper, there was a night watchman. Security is perhaps too broad of a term. There were camp coordinators, right? So basically, the program director, activities director, tribe coordinator, the counselors themselves. The counselors themselves were stratified into different levels of experience. And there's a whole other sub story we could talk about here about the change in ratios. By opening the secondary campsite of Cypress Lake, they were now increasing their business model with additional campers. And keep in mind, this was after the pandemic. And so, even though somewhere like Texas may not have had the same protocols for COVID as we might have had in Canada, it was still hard to find staff, I would imagine, in 2025, unless you were doing something amazing. When I worked at my summer camp, we were paid pennies on the dollar and we loved it. And that was okay. And many of us came from privilege and we didn't need to make that much money. We could do a job that we loved for the summer and really enjoy it. So I'm not suggesting that these camp counselors were not dedicated who were on site, but it can be hard to staff those positions if you are offering less than minimum wage. And some summer camps in some states or provinces are allowed to pay less than minimum wage because it is a residential application where it's over a 24-hour clock, not a 9 to 5 or 8-hour business day clock. Meals and accommodation are included, kind of like an au pair or a nanny situation where you're not getting paid minimum wage on an hourly basis. They talk about the counselors. And the main thing I want to stress is that they talk about not only increasing the ratio because they probably didn't have enough staff like counselors for both sites. There were 560-ish people in the original site and almost 200 people-ish on the new site. They didn't have enough counselors. And in my speculation, because of the pandemic, they didn't have enough senior counselors. So when I went to camp, most people kept going back to camp every summer until something changed where they couldn't keep going. I did not keep going in 2006 because I did summer study abroad. That was a natural halt and I never went back. So let's say during the pandemic, you stopped going to camp in 2020, 2021, 2022. No different from any other industry, there would have been a loss of history and seniority. You would no longer have those experienced counselors coming back in 2024, 2025. And so what they call their counselorette, their junior first year counselors, they were not paired in 2025 with senior counselors at the same rate that they would have been historically. And especially in incidences like the Bubble Inn, you had two junior counselors working together with 13 8 to 9-year-old children, which is just completely mind-boggling to me. When I was working with that age, we would have maximum in the cabin of 5. And I could be alone as a counselor for 5, or I could have an assistant counselor, a junior counselor with me for that same 5. And that was still sometimes a lot to make sure that they're, getting to meals, getting dressed, getting showered, brushing their teeth, dealing with homesickness. It's a lot to care for children. And so to have two 18-year-old, like lovely, lovely girls by all accounts from their in memoriams, but to be responsible for 13 children is a bit shocking to me and doesn't get enough line space in this document, in my opinion, but maybe that's not factual, or maybe that's hard for the investigators to understand. I feel I have that perspective as a camp counselor to share that. They talk about the photographers. They talk about the nurses. We could have a whole other conversation about the nurses. There is a separate thread I was reading. I follow the Unexpected Spy on Instagram. This is a woman who lives in Texas. She's a former CIA and FBI agent. Her name is Tracy, forgive me, something Waldner. She's always sharing news stories. And recently, I believe, well, I'm fairly confident, I've watched the video. One of the nurses from Camp Mystic either recently lost her license permanently or temporarily regarding, it was basically like medication control procedures and some other issues that are very, very serious. So they don't get into that here, but there is a separate plot happening, sidebar, as there are with many of these things regarding the nursing staff. Nursing staff were not responsible for the evacuation or the care of the children at 3 a.m. But what I'm speculating and alleging, sorry, I'm not alleging, speculating, is that if you had those types of lackadaisical procedures in the infirmary, which it's very unfortunate that their infirmary was called Heaven Can Wait. Like, that's just not good. Um, but if you had lackadaisical procedures in the infirmary, it's not surprising to me that you would also have lackadaisical procedures, by my deduction, at a lower level of concern, i.e., emergency procedures. Like, medication control is very serious. Uh, Emergency procedures should also be serious, but I could see how if you don't care about one, you don't care about the other. The kitchen workers. So most sleepaway summer camps, when you're feeding 6, 7, 800 people per day, 3 times a day, plus snacks, you hire a team, and they may not be actual camp counselors. They are experienced professional kitchen staff. In this incident, they were hired from overseas. They came from Poland. We don't know the number of prep cooks, dining hall attendants, or store workers mentioned, but there was enough of them. There was 6 women mentioned, and some men are also mentioned without any specifics. They did not contribute any assistance to the evacuation or the crisis or the catastrophe, nor should they be guilty of anything, because they were explicitly told, do not interact with the customers, do not talk to the campers, do not socialize or fraternize. And English was not necessarily their first language. But to not involve those adults in an emergency or not have prepared to use those bodies is pretty shocking. Same as the ground crews, who are laborers, they say, that are hired seasonally from Mexico on work visas. You will see in a photo further down that they did assist with moving some equipment, but then where did they go? They didn't help. Nor were they expected to, nor were they directed to. I'm not blaming them, but it was a missed opportunity to have them help. They know the camp inside and out. Many of them were there year after year. Even if they don't know about flash flooding, they know the high points from mowing. Like, anyway. Thank you if you're still with me. We are reaching some key points. I know it's been a little while. So there's some more graphics here about where people were sleeping, where they were assigned to live. This is important to the story, but difficult to track. And then this is the chart that I mentioned. The number of non-cabin counselor adults present on the property that could have assisted in an emergency, right? The garage had over 9 grounds crew. They did not help. There were over 6 female kitchen staff. They did not help. Wives like Tweety Eastland stayed in her home. Nurses, as we understand it, stayed in the infirmary, right? They didn't either know what was happening, or they were told based on text messages from people to shelter in place, or they were in an area that they literally did not know that the flooding was occurring. So it's hard to dial it down to one smoking gun, but this is pretty egregious. This is the only emergency preparation that existed at Camp Mystic. And as they say in this report, this single piece of paper was replicated throughout the property. It was stapled into cabins. It was provided to counselors during their training in a binder. It existed in the office, but it did not have any more detail than this single piece of paper to allegedly cover, for a 750-acre property with over 700 people, accidents, floods, tornadoes, fires, and the infirmary. What I can say about my camp, we were provided a staff manual, and it was something to the tune of 30, 40, 50 pages. And I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was way better than this. We did practice some emergency responses, primarily for missing child, for water, like waterfront emergencies, fire, like undoing the hose. We wouldn't have battled a fire, but just like triaging a fire. So as many gaps as I see in my own camp experience, this is just absolutely shocking that, well, and I wonder too, like, did the dishes inspector, at no point there was no comments of like, hey, you should do more than this? Or This is what will be the linchpin, I'm sure, of lawsuits, that there was nothing. Communication was a huge problem at Camp Mystic. Camp counselors were not allowed to have their cell phones in their cabins, which I understand from a camper experience perspective, but as is highlighted in the report, is pretty shocking. If you're going to leave two counselors alone with 13 children in a cabin at night from tuck-in time to breakfast, and they don't have a phone to call someone in an emergency, they're relying on walkie-talkies where the batteries might die, the signal might not work, the volume gets turned down. That is siloing. That's also extremely dangerous. The camp I worked at, we didn't have our phones back in the day, but we were also no more than 10 feet from another cabin with counselors or cabins. So when we look at the geography of Camp Mystic, there was physical geographical separation. And so to not have your phone, not be able to text, not be able to call, I understand the thinking, but practically for emergency preparedness makes no sense. To say nothing of the absence of access to cellular data versus Wi-Fi. And then there was a big reliance on radios, but not everybody had radios. This goes into a little bit of Dick Eastland's weather station monitoring. There was a PA system that was used regularly throughout the days, but not used during the emergency. This timeline is extremely helpful when we start looking at the minute by minute what happened. And I'm not going to try and reconstruct the whole thing. The main thing that I think is important is that everything final happened in an hour. So there were many opportunities prior to the final incident where the cabins, the campers could have been evacuated. We can no longer say Dick Eastland didn't know about the report at 1:14 in the morning. The forensic investigation of his phone says, he wasn't sleeping. He was actively checking radar, his weather app, news reporting, social media, what have you. I can't say about the social media. That's my added commentary. Then they went to move a bunch of these boats. It was 2 something, 1:45, and then there's a photo at 2 something. Then the one that gets me, and I don't know why it's not in this timeline. Here it is, 2:30. Bug house and lookout in counselors run to the office to report water in the cabins. And then they tell them, don't worry, we'll drive you back, shelter in place. And then 20 minutes later, he decides, oh no, wait, you were right. We should evacuate those buildings. He evacuates bug house, look-in, hangout cabins. And then the final incident with twins and Bubble In occurs at 3:51. And we know he was submerged in his vehicle because I guess he had a smartwatch and it recorded submersion in water at 3:51. And you'll see later in the report, it's pretty upsetting. There's reports of the top of the vehicle, his Chevy Tahoe, submerged, being visible in the water, like the roof of the vehicle submerged. And to jump to also very troubling, he put all of the campers and the counselors in the Tahoe, like in an attempt to evacuate them. A Chevy Tahoe is a pretty big vehicle, but I don't know how you squeeze 13 8-year-old children and 2 teenage 18-year-old counselors and 1 driver into a Chevy Tahoe in normal conditions, never mind in thundering, rainy, cold, dark conditions. And then the vehicle was lifted and floated away as best as they know. Yeah, so they go through the counselor training, which was inadequate, completely inadequate for the price point of this camp, for what they're offering in terms of hazards and risks. The one thing I can say about my camp, we weren't paid a lot. We didn't have perfect emergency response protocols. We didn't have a lot of documentation. It was a lot of mentoring and on-the-job learning. But I learned so much that I carried forward into aquatic management in terms of customer service, working with kids, being part of a team, being a leader, taking responsibility. That part though you can't overly rely upon. You do need competency training. It's just wholly inaccurate from what has been reported here. They talk about the arrival of the campers. So this is the really sad thing. I'm sure the parents of the deceased children are really upset about this. The children died less than 4 days after they arrived. So the first day of the session, like the time when people come to camp for their stay, was on June 29th, and this incident took place at 3:30, 4 a.m. on July 4th. Excuse me. So if you didn't go to that camp session, you would have survived. Then they go through the inspection. I'm sure there'll be a lot more coming out about the inspection. I've seen some allegations that the Department of Social and Human Services, DSHS, is going to be sued by the families. There'll be more disclosure there, I think. The inspector assigned to Camp Mystic was Maricela Zamaripa, and she also toured the site the previous year, so July 2nd. And then the big thing that is highlighted here is that she stated that, yes, required emergency plans. Is there a written plan of procedures to be implemented in case of a disaster, serious accident, epidemic, or fatality formulated and posted in the camp's administrative on-site office or location? Yes, it's posted, but it's not really thorough. Are all camp staff and volunteers made aware of the plan of emergency to be implemented during the staff training program or volunteer briefing? She checks yes. They have some interviews and comments from counselors basically describing what they were told and taught, but it was far less than sufficient. Is there documentation of this training kept at the camp's administrative on-site office or location? This is the classic like consultant or audit piece. They can prove they did the training, but they can't prove that the training was adequate or comprehensive or what was in the training. They just have a list of who attended the training for the 2 days before the session started. So they go through this in detail, and this is where I want to really reiterate that this report is truly excellent and a good read if you have the time to chip through it. It only took me about an hour and a half, and it's definitely worth it, especially if you're talking about something that you could actually implement at your facility, aquatics, recreation, camps, otherwise. Then they introduce the events of the day in question. Its incident started on Thursday, July 3rd. In terms of the available information, they get into the sick local government emergency management person. I don't think that's material, respectfully, to this incident. The business, the camp should have been following and was, to the best of our knowledge, Dick Eastland was following other resources, not just the county officials. This is just the briefing from from the county, what you should do. This is a multi-page, I would say like a 30-page kind of blow by blow, what this person was doing, what this person was doing. Like this reconstruction is probably what took the better part of the last few months to figure out who did what did they eat for dinner at camp, when did the children go to bed, who was where, who went to bed at this time, who was on days off, who was going to pick up so-and-so whose vehicle broke down. What was this person doing before they went to bed? What was this person doing, right? That's exactly what this is going through. Night watchman arrived for his shift. This person radioed a volunteer to do this. They played taps at 10:15. And so I would also say this is illustrative in terms of who knew about the weather, who didn't. Very few people who didn't have phones or technology or Wi-Fi, i.e. the campers or the counselors, were aware of the weather that was forecasted, but it started on July 3rd. Then they go into individual counselors who had access to their phone, who got the reports of flash flooding, the counselors who disregarded instructions and fled their cabins as the water started to enter, or people who noticed the rain, noticed the thunderstorms, right? They talked about the actual reporting that was provided to some people, right? The flash flood warning actually was received by numerous people at Camp Mystic, but there was no protocol to do anything about it. Other adults continued to sleep in their bunks. Some counselors received the warning, right? So, and nobody felt empowered to do anything. I don't think it's anybody didn't do anything. I think they felt like, I'm not in charge. I'm not entitled to do anything. Nobody's going to listen. I'm going to get in trouble. So then we start to hear what Dick Eastland was doing in terms of walkie-talking with his son, contacting other family members, staff members, and then basic water flooding is a broad term, but the water aggregation, several inches of rain. And then at 2:14, the grounds crew had finished moving the waterfront equipment. So this is where you'll see starting at about 1:45, he asks the Mexican grounds crew to move a bunch of equipment. And then this, the photo, oh my gosh, this photo just totally blindsided me. So we have no urgency yet because we have time to stop and take a photo. People are happy. I'm not blaming the grounds crew, but this gives you a sense, like a snapshot in time of how little anybody had a sense of what was happening. And I'm not saying the grounds crew should be following the weather. That's not their job. They were off hours, sleeping. They got up, they moved the equipment. But that, like, yeah, let's, like, middle of the night, rainstorm, let's chat. It really, I think, is a time capsule of what nobody was worried yet, or he wasn't worried yet. Talks about concern growing, right? So it goes downhill from here, paragraph by paragraph, who was doing what, when, how, which cabins were evacuated, when, who got out, who didn't. There's a few photos that show kind of the status of the rain. Already we can see it's getting up to mid-calf level. Like, it's just horrific. This is really, really troubling. The last little pages of the document are taking you through what exactly happened literally in each cabin that we know about. So Chatterbox, Gigglebox, Nut Hut, self-evacuation, counselors who disregarded their supervisor and saved their children. And then the one that was horrific to me was this rec hall. So this is, as I understand it, this is a hall that is used for a bunch of different activities. We had halls like this at my camp for rainy days, skits, shows, crafts, dancing, whatever. So a bunch of campers and their counselors fled uphill to Rec Hall, which is great, but it started to flood in Rec Hall. 100 children and counselors were on this balcony, and the water reached the edge of the balcony, and they were very aware that this is overloading the balcony. This is an old building in Texas, dry heat, right? Dry timber. And the fact that this balcony did not collapse was just, I mean, if it had collapsed, you would have had another 100 people died. So I took this and several other mentions in this report as clear evidence that we don't even realize how bad it was. We know that 28 people died, 27 children. That's awful. That's catastrophic. The worst flooding of, not flooding incident like Hurricane Katrina, but like the most devastating single incident of its type. But now, if you also know that another 100 children also could have died with a simple cracked timber, collapsing balcony in an old 100-year-old building, probably, you realize how much worse it could have been. Cozy Corner, they're talking about other buildings around camp. Polar Palace is where the kitchen staff were, the garage, the individual homes, the guardhouse, Senior Hill, Ranch House, Cypress Hollow, Lake Camp. Okay. So I'm just going to summarize some of the most awful parts before we talk about the last part, which is how poorly they managed the incident and the communication. So I apologize, this is very graphic, but the children who died were the youngest campers in the buildings closest to the river. Bubble in, all 13 campers and the two 18-year-old counselors drowned. There was not enough. Let me get my story straight. So this is where Dick Eastland allegedly put them all in the Chevy Tahoe attempted to evacuate them. The vehicle was swept away. They were not all found in the Chevy Tahoe. They were found in different locations, their bodies, but they all died. And then the neighboring twins cabin, they realized there was not enough distance to the roof. The water was going to come in and drown them. And so the camp counselors, this is awful, were pushing the children out through the windows and doors in the water, like trying to swim out to try and save them because they were going to drown in the building. The roof wasn't that high. Some of the children made it out, grabbed on to another Eastland man and were rescued. Others ended up in trees. Others ended up downriver. Others ended up grabbing on to like poles and what have you. And some did not make it. Some drowned in the building. Some drowned in the river. It's just horrible. But it was very much those two buildings with the younger children closer to the river that were the children who died at the close to 4 o'clock, in conjunction with Dick's Eastland evacuating some and not others. It's horrible. This was all around 4 a.m, and the water started to recede around 5:30. As if this whole incident wasn't bad enough in terms of the lack of preparation, the lack of equipment, the lack of training, the lack of the other one that got me was 911. Nobody at the camp administration called 911 until 5:30 in the morning, but a camp counselor with a phone she wasn't supposed to have called 911 at 3:30 in the morning. But nobody at the camp called until 5:30, which is its own shocking thing. But one of the things that's really, really worse is the final part of this report talks about how botched the communication was in terms of managing the incident. And in a non-empathetic way, it makes sense because everything allegedly, it appears, was connected back to Dick Eastland. So if he wasn't there and he was missing and he's now dead, there's nobody to implement leadership or a PR strategy or communication. And this is why chain of command is so important. Like, let's say your rec director's on vacation and you have a fatality at your aquatic facility. Who's going to stand in who has public relations training or media training or knows what to do? You always need to have a designate. One of my jobs as a municipal aquatic manager, I didn't love being in charge, but when my rec director would go away, each portfolio person would take turns being rec director while she was gone, acting rec director, right? Signing authority for certain things and what have you. And so the lack of communication, leadership, preparedness is further identified in how poorly they managed the incident for the children and the parents, both those who survived and those who did not. So as you'll see, Camp Mystic's emergency procedures binder, kept in the main office, included a one-page crisis response outline. Although there is no evidence that anyone responding to the flood's aftermath was familiar with this outline or actually executed its plan, the contents are indicative of Camp Mystic's preparedness for such a situation, i.e., no preparedness, right? So the things you're supposed to do: find out what happened, call emergency services, stabilize the situation. Like, it reads like a template you got off the internet and you did not adjust it to your facility operations, which is what I always preach to my clients and my certified pool operator students. A health inspector is not going to allow you to have just a template that's not adjusted for your actual facility operations, right? Contact parents and guardians, communication and notification, keep records. Like, they had no plan for PR, communication, what have you. And so it's so bad. I can't even summarize it. They didn't know who was missing. They, I mean, and there were campers and kids and counselors all over the property. Throughout the report, they talk about like the campers and counselors were traumatized, throwing up in this building, and they were not discovered for 3 hours. They were left alone. Like, there was no adult going around rounding up, or, okay, this building we have 5 people, this building we have 20 people. They're okay, they're not okay. Like, there was no triage that was done. There was no communication. It's just awful. So they didn't know who was missing. Then they do a roll call around 7 a.m., and they start hearing about 2 campers who were found alive at a neighboring property. And then they start doing imprecise notification. So, um, at 7:11, they call 911 and they say 30 people are missing. Like, hello, you called at 5:30. What did you tell them at 5:30? And then you waited until 7:11 to realize people are missing? Like, you knew Dick Eastland was missing at a minimum. Who was it? You were in shock, you were not communicating. Some people knew some things and not others, right? With Dick Eastland missing, there was no assigned spokesperson for the camp and no prepared protocol for phone calls, right? Camp Mystics resulting communication with parents was not planned, orderly, or consistent. And then, as you may or may not know, like any tight knit community in camp, parents talk, there's Facebook groups. Like, people are going to find out about this through neighboring people in the area. So they start calling parents of missing girls at 9 a.m., but they don't call them all before an email is sent out, right? So they send out an email at 11:28 saying, if we haven't called you, your daughter's okay, but they haven't called everyone whose daughter is missing. And then there's also a false narrative floating around from a Texas game warden saying that everybody's been found and that nobody's missing, which is wrong. So all of these parents had false hope that their child was alive when they were in fact missing. Then there's confusion about where to pick up the campers in terms of come collect your kids. They have reunification with living campers and parents in the public school with the same thing with the parents who are waiting to find out if their daughter's missing or unaccounted for, which is traumatic. And then they get into physical examples where, like, one mother arrived to identify her daughter's body and was shown the wrong remains. However, she thought she recognized that child. After identifying her own child, the funeral home asks that mother to call the family of the other child and ask about bracelets. Upon learning the color matched the bracelets of the child at the funeral home, a law enforcement officer takes the phone and asks the family to come identify their daughter, who they may not have even known was missing, or it all happened in the last 8 hours. So it just goes on and on. And so this is where I think they're pulling in Kerr County, like they weren't prepared. The local staff were not prepared to manage an emergency like this. But it's also on the camp to have an emergency management plan or to hire people or to bring in people to help with this if you don't know what to do. They do eventually establish an EOC. There continues to be no guidance. And so there's still kids missing. And the parents decide to, like 9/11, they start posting photos of missing campers and their phone number, like, have you seen my child? So then they start getting prank calls, which is terrible for the families. Then the next day, they make a new list of missing children. And then one dad shows up to the camp and discovers nobody's doing a search and rescue. He finds a body under some debris at the camp that's not his daughter, and he doesn't know what to do with the body. And then it just keeps going on and on. Like, and it takes weeks for them to they start doing DNA collection to identify bodies, and it takes several weeks to identify who's been found, who's missing. And to this day, one child, sealed Stewart, is still not recovered. So to summarize the conclusions, like, it's good to have a summary, but it's just all bad. And I think that's where we're going to continue to dissect this. Maybe not me professionally, like my interests are still here, but I think in Texas and in camps and aquatics and recreation, this is going to be a watershed moment, no pun intended, where it's there's so many layers to the onion. Like, there's so much more that we can learn from each specific incident. Like, the incident as a whole has so many kernels: leadership, span of control, not micromanaging, having clear job descriptions, having, plan A, B, C, having emergency response, emergency equipment. I mean, I don't even think I mentioned that one counselor takes her campers to one building that she thinks is like got an emergency stash of food supplies and blankets and a first aid kit, and she opens the cupboard and there's nothing there. Now, they don't tell us why she thought there would be equipment there, if she'd been told that or trained that, or if there was a label. But, like, there wasn't even the emergency food and flashlights and first aid kit that she expected, right? Like, there was no preparation. As we talk about in aquatics, right? Go bags or evacuation kits or first aid supplies. Like, anyway, this is a long video. We're almost there. So there's a lot of recommendations, right? Camp Mystic, or conclusions rather. Camp Mystic did not have written emergency plans that complied with state requirements. That's at a minimum level. They probably also did not they did not meet minimum industry standards of care. I'm sure if you look at other camps in the area, they probably had pages and pages and binders of training. Camp Mystic did not have written emergency plans. The emergency plans focused primarily on shelter in place and await further instruction, but also without any sort of communication plan to do that. So if you were going to tell people to shelter in place in 40 buildings, how are you going to communicate with each building to stop shelter in place? Who's going to go get them, or who's going to go release them? Procedures were not reviewed for flooding with camp staff or counselors. And I also think it's important, next one, campers were not instructed, right? Like, when I was a camper, if you're lost, go here. If you're hurt, go here. If you can't find your counselor, go here. If you're homesick, go here, right? Flooding, if you know you're on a floodplain, and that's where it was reasonably foreseeable because the floodplain was identified in 2011. They had knowledge of flooding in 1978 and 1980 something. You might not have wanted to believe it, but you were in the floodplain according to geological survey. Very little was documented or communicated in writing to staff, counselors, or campers. Camp Mystic did not adequately prepare for the storm in terms of the weather alerts, to say nothing of supplies. Like, think about, I would imagine, I don't live in Florida, but let's say you live in a hurricane zone. You have emergency water, blankets, you have a full tank of gas, you have a go bag, right? The camp could have done more. They could have had people staying up. They could have had people monitoring the weather. They could have evacuated, canceled camp, lots of things. They talk about the issues with the flood watch in Kerr County. There was no awareness of the potential for extreme weather. There was no there was no acting on the flash flood warning. Very little assigned responsibility. No timely evacuation despite ample time to do so, right? Could have been evacuated on July 3rd, the evening of July 3rd, the daytime, 1 a.m., 2:30, when those camp counselors said, hey, we have a problem. 3 o'clock, 3:30, right? They waited too long. What I didn't get into in this video that they talk about repeatedly in this report is that early on, when there was no substantial water accumulation, everybody could have evacuated on foot. And that's what it says here. All campers still had the opportunity to evacuate by foot, and that didn't happen. There were places that never flooded. There were safe areas of the property. It's not like the whole property flooded. They just didn't evacuate. Dozens of other adults in close proximity were never tasked to assist with cabins, right? Even a simple help, come help, or hey, you know, Jose, hey, you, Larissa, come help me. Nobody took that initiative on the Eastland or the camp management side to direct, but they did have them move furniture, or boats rather, right? Some campers became separated from their counselors without adequate supervision for the remainder of the flood event. I am sure there's many campers who are traumatized by this. They survived, but like I said earlier, they were left in a cabin, they were left in an outbuilding, they were left in an area while they were dealing with the more critical issue for hours. You know, they might have been hiding in a cabin from 3:30 a.m. till 10 a.m., cold, wet, hungry, scared, lonely, and their counselors did what they could, but no adult, no manager, no director of the camp came and checked on them. In all likelihood, Dick Eastland loaded all campers and both counselors from Bubble Inn in his vehicle. It was swept into the Guadalupe River, and all 13 campers and both counselors perished. I I don't even know how they all fit in the vehicle other than we have no other option. You have to do this. We have to go. One camper perished in her cabin. That was in Twins 2, where I told you that they had to push them out of the cabin because they were going to drown in the ceiling. The water was rising to the ceiling. She did not get out. All the others were swept away. Some survived, but 11 did not. And then one child tried to go back to her cabin to retrieve something. She was also lost. This one is very egregious. Camp leadership did not attempt to call 911 during the flood or immediately afterwards. 5:30 a.m. is not immediately afterwards. 7:20 to say we're missing 30 people, not afterwards. The first counselor with a phone that worked tried calling at 3:30 in the morning. Reunification efforts. Well, and we should also say the cell phones were inconsistent, but the landlines, like they had access to landlines at Cypress Lake, walkie-talkie to landlines, and you'll hear in the report if you go back and read it, or you'll see rather, at Cypress Lake they overheard everything on the walkie-talkies. They didn't try and help because they were trapped. The creek had flooded, but they could hear everything on the walkie-talkies. So if somebody said, "Hey, Cypress Lake, we need you to call 911," they probably could have from their landline there. Reunification efforts and incident management were chaotic and traumatic for the families and probably for the campers who survived too. And then it goes through a summary of the legislative reforms in terms of the Heavens 27 Act, Camp Safety Act, implementation of changes for the 2026 season, and then building elevations, mapping, and distances between structures so we know how far apart they are, and some more maps. Yeah. So did not expect to be on here for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Thank you for watching if you did watch or listen this far. I hope we can all take away some things from this horrible incident. I think we will continue to see this incident reported in the news, maybe not outside of Texas. It may just be in my algorithm and my networks where I'm following this a bit more than the average person. But as a camper, counselor, aquatic professional, there's just, you couldn't have predicted the flooding, but it was, people said it was going to happen. I think that's the big thing that I come back to. I remember Hurricane Katrina. I was in Ottawa in a hotel room when the TV footage started to come out. What would have that have been? 2005, 2006. I had been to Louisiana the previous year, so I was invested in it. As I recall, and this may not be factual, but as I recall, it was the storm of the century. Nobody expected the levees to fail and the city to flood. The thing that I come back to with this, your camp was marked in a floodplain. You actively sought to remove structures from that mapping without changing anything. It was approved by FEMA, which is a whole separate conversation, but the buildings never changed. And you didn't have procedures, and it was reasonably foreseeable that the flooding would happen. Even if you didn't believe all those things, there was adequate reporting that bad weather was going to happen the day before. And the linchpin for me now, having read this, the forensic data that he was on his phone, tracking radar, tracking weather, had access to reporting, had his AccuRite, like domestic weather station. There's text messages to his wife and his family members about rain accumulation. All we can say is he didn't make a good decision. Don't know why. Report says that many times. We wish we knew why. It's inexplicable. But yeah, I have empathy and sympathy for the parents that gave their children in care to this business and have every right to be egregiously upset, because no system should fail on the decisions of one person, but it clearly did here. There was no collaboration, communication, leadership outside of one person. I don't want to say it was a dictatorship because I don't know the person and I don't have, all of the interview data, but a classic example where the structure, the organization cannot fail when one person is out of the mix, disabled or missing or gone. every organization should be able to function reasonably well. You know, if I call in sick, my employee should be able to take over or what have you. And it's just incomprehensible that all of this had to come to light because of a situation that was reasonably foreseeable and at many junctures could have been halted, not halted the flooding, but could have we could have done something that stopped this result from happening. So yeah. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.